My wife is demanding I evict my mother for calling her low-class trash. We hosted the party in our Seattle backyard on a blistering Saturday in mid-June. 60 guests, catered brisket from a place in Ballard, and heavy string lights zigzagging over the patio. It was supposed to be a flawless afternoon celebrating our son Connor, heading off to college. My mother Margaret lives in the remodeled carriage house at the back of our lot. We spent $85,000 renovating it 2 years ago so she could live rent-free. Everything seemed fine during the party. She mingled. She drank white wine. She smiled for the photos. The explosion didn't happen until the following morning. At exactly 9:15 am on Sunday, my wife Renee was sitting at the kitchen island helping Connor log his gifts for thank you notes. I was pouring dark roast coffee, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, when Renee went perfectly still. She was holding a heavy cream envelope. It was the card my mother had handed Connor the day before. Renee didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked over to me, her face completely drained of color, and silently slid the card across the cold granite counter. Inside was a cashier's check for $5,000. Beneath it, in my mother's elegant, looping cursive, was a 2-paragraph letter. The final lines read, "Use this money to pursue a serious profession, Connor. Look at your father. He had so much potential before he anchored himself to a basic office temp. You are meant to associate with a much higher class of people." Renee has been an executive assistant for 16 years. She grew up in Spokane with a father who worked as a diesel mechanic. She didn't have a trust fund. What she had was a work ethic that frankly terrified me when we met in our 20s. She worked grueling 60-hour weeks at a downtown logistics firm to pay off my mechanical engineering loans when we were practically drowning in debt. She sacrificed her own weekends, her own vacations, and her own peace of mind. She literally funded the comfortable life my mother now enjoys. Renee looked at me without blinking. Her voice was flat. "She has 30 days to pack her things and vacate the property." "Renee," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I know this is vile, but it's just a spiteful letter." She deliberately handed our 18-year-old son a printed manifesto calling his mother low-class trash. She waited until he achieved a major milestone to try and poison his respect for me. "Where is she going to go?" I pleaded, feeling the walls of the kitchen shrinking around me. "Rents in this zip code are $2,400 a month. Her monthly fixed pension is barely half that. She'll end up in a rundown facility in the suburbs. She should have researched current real estate prices before calling her landlord an office temp." Renee replied quietly. She wasn't wrong. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culmination of 16 years of relentless, calculated disrespect. My mother wore mourning black to our vow renewal. She constantly refers to Renee's promotion to senior E as a typing gig. She asks Renee to fetch her things at family dinners, as if Renee is the hired help. I had spent a decade absorbing the toxicity, categorizing it as generational differences rather than malice. I told myself my mother was just old-fashioned. I forced Renee to swallow the poison year after year because confronting my mother felt like detonating a bomb in our own living room. I walked out to the carriage house that afternoon. The heat had broken, leaving the air thick and sticky. My mother was sitting on her private porch, drinking iced tea with a slice of lemon, reading a hardcover biography. She looked entirely at peace. "You need to explain this," I said, holding up the cream envelope. She didn't even put her book down. She just glanced over the rim of her reading glasses. "I am motivating my grandson. He needs to understand ambition. He's going to a top-tier university, not community college. You insulted my wife, the woman who paid for the roof over your head, the woman who picked out the quartz countertops in your kitchen. Renee wants you out." My mother let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. "You aren't going to throw your mother onto the street over a piece of stationery. Don't be theatrical." That was the exact moment I realized the depth of the delusion. She truly believed she was untouchable. Nobody had ever held her accountable for her venom. She thought her title as my mother granted her absolute diplomatic immunity in my home. The situation escalated past the point of no return 3 days later. I came home from work on Wednesday at 4:30 to find a white commercial landscaping truck parked at an angle in our driveway. The tailgate was down. A guy in a neon vest was dragging bags of concrete mix across our lawn. I got out of my car, confused. I walked around the side of the house and stopped dead. My mother had unilaterally hired a contractor, handed them a stack of cash, and ordered them to rip up Renee's prize-winning endless summer hydrangea beds to pour a concrete patio extension for her carriage house. The hydrangeas were gone, slashed to the root. Mangled soil and crushed stems were piled carelessly against the fence. Renee had planted those bushes the week Connor was born. They were her pride. "Hey," I yelled at the contractor. "What the hell are you doing?" A guy with a thick beard and a sunburnt neck walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You the owner?" The older lady out back paid us to pour a 12-by-12 slab, said she needed room for a fire pit. "Stop right now. Pack up your gear. You're destroying my wife's garden." The guy, his shirt said Thad, looked uncomfortable. "Man, she paid me in cash. The forms are already set." Before I could reply, the back door of the main house opened. Renee walked out. She was wearing her work clothes, a navy skirt suit. She took one look at the destroyed hydrangeas. She looked at the wooden forms staked into the mud. She looked at my mother, who was watching from the carriage house window. Renee didn't say a word to me. She didn't yell at Thad. She just turned around, walked back into the house, and locked the door. When I got inside, she was sitting at the dining room table with her laptop open. She had her phone on speaker. She was talking to her sister Blythe, who works in real estate law downtown. Blythe is not a warm person. She is surgical. I could hear her voice crackling through the phone speaker. "You have no formal lease agreement, correct? She pays no rent. That makes her a tenant at will. In Washington state, you only need to provide a 20-day notice to terminate a month-to-month or at will tenancy. I'll draft the notice to quit. I'm emailing it to you now. Arlo has to sign it as the primary on the deed. Right now, I am sitting at the dining room table. In front of me is a formal, legally binding 20-day notice to quit. It is printed on crisp white paper. It requires my signature. I love the woman who gave me life. I love the woman who built a life with me. One is an arrogant 70-year-old who pushed her luck too far and has nowhere else to go. The other is a fiercely loyal partner who has endured relentless humiliation and is finally demanding the respect she is owed. One requires my charity. The other has earned my loyalty. I am staring at the signature line, holding a black pilot pen, terrified of the ink. I press the tip of the pen against the paper. The ink bleeds slightly into the fiber. I sign my name. Renee watches me do it. She doesn't smile. There is no victory in her eyes, just a bone-deep exhaustion. She takes the paper from the table, slides it into a manila envelope, and hands it back to me. "You serve her," Renee says. "I am not speaking to that woman again unless it is in a courtroom." room. I walk back out into the yard. The sun is starting to set, casting long, sharp shadows across the ruined dirt where the hydrangeas used to be. Thad and his crew are gone, but they left the wooden forms in the ground, a crude square of lumber staking a claim on my property. I knock on the carriage house door. The glass is frosted, but I can see my mother's silhouette moving inside. She opens the door wearing a silk robe. She looks at the manila envelope in my hand. If this is about the bushes, I will buy her new ones at Home Depot, my mother says, her tone dripping with boredom. They were attracting bees anyway. It's not about the bushes, Mom. I hold out the envelope. This is a formal notice to vacate. You have 20 days to move out, by law. She stares at my hand. She doesn't take the envelope. You're pathetic. Your wife snaps her fingers and you show up at my door with fake legal documents? It's not fake. Blythe drafted it. If you aren't out in 20 days, we will file an unlawful detainer lawsuit and have the sheriff remove you. My voice shakes, but I force myself to maintain eye contact. I signed it. Renee didn't make me do it. You crossed the line. My mother's eyes narrow. The aristocratic amusement vanishes from her face, replaced by something entirely different, something cold and calculating. I am not leaving, she says. This is my home. You built this for me. I built it so you could be close to Connor. You used it as a base camp to insult my wife. Take the envelope. Tape it to the door, Arlo, she spits out. Because I'm not touching it. She slams the door in my face. The deadbolt clicks. I use a piece of blue painter's tape from my pocket to affix the notice to the glass. As I walk back to the main house, I feel a sickening mixture of guilt and relief. It's done. The clock is ticking. But I underestimate how deeply my mother is willing to dig in. The first week of the 20-day countdown is an agonizing standoff. The carriage house is exactly 40 feet from our kitchen window. Every time Renee washes a dish or pours a glass of water, she has to look at the structure where my mother is quietly gathering her ammunition. My mother stops coming out during the day. She stops waving to Connor when he leaves for his summer job. Instead, she starts making phone calls. On day 8, the mail arrives. I pull a thick envelope from the box. The return address isn't from my mother. It's from a firm called Trask & Associates. I open it standing in the driveway. It's a letter of representation from an attorney named Caden Trask. It states that his client, Margaret, is formally contesting the eviction. The letter claims that because she contributed $8,000 of her own money toward the interior fixtures of the carriage house 2 years ago, she is not a tenant at will, but an investor with an equitable interest in the property. Furthermore, Trask claims that evicting a 70-year-old woman with a fixed income constitutes a form of elder financial abuse, and he threatens to file an injunction to freeze the entire property if we proceed. I walk into the house and hand the letter to Renee. She reads it twice. The muscles in her jaw feather. Did she pay for the fixtures? Renee asks, her voice deadly calm. She bought the custom shower door, I admit, feeling a cold sweat break out on my neck, and the imported tiles for the backsplash. It was maybe $6,000. She insisted. I didn't think it meant she owned the building. Renee places the letter on the counter. She is trying to bleed us in legal fees, so we drop it. She knows we don't have a retainer lying around right after paying Connor's first semester tuition. Before I can answer, we hear the front door open. Connor walks in. He's wearing his work apron from the hardware store. He looks at me, then at Renee, sensing the suffocating tension in the room. He looks at the letter on the counter. What's going on? Connor asks. Renee steps back. Your grandmother hired a lawyer to fight the eviction. Connor doesn't look shocked. He reaches into his backpack and pulls out the cream envelope, the one with the $5,000 check. He places it next to the lawyer's letter. She tried to give this back to me this morning, Connor says quietly. She caught me by the driveway. She said I was going to need it because my parents were about to go bankrupt paying legal fees. My stomach drops. What did you say to her? I told her I didn't want her money, Connor says, and she told me I was acting just like a working-class loser, exactly like Mom. Renee closes her eyes. A tear escapes, tracking down her cheek, but she brushes it away instantly. Connor looks at me, his 18-year-old face hardening into something resembling an adult's grim realization. Dad, someone else is living in the carriage house. I freeze. What do you mean, someone else? When she cornered me this morning, her door was open. There's a woman in there, a younger woman. She had a suitcase. I don't wait for another word. I walk straight out the back door, crossing the 40 feet of lawn in seconds. I pound my fist against the frosted glass of the carriage house. Mom, open the door. The lock turns. But it isn't my mother who opens the door. It's a woman in her late 40s, wearing hospital scrubs and a lanyard. She looks at me with a polite, completely practiced expression. Can I help you? She asks. Who the hell are you? I demand. Where's my mother? Margaret is resting, the woman says smoothly. I'm Vita. I'm her new live-in caregiver. She hired me yesterday. Since she is suffering from severe emotional distress, she requires around-the-clock monitoring. I've already moved my things into the secondary room. She smiles, a thin, chilling expression. I believe under local ordinance, you can't evict a registered medical caregiver without a separate 90-day notice. I stared at her. The brass doorknob was still in her hand. Her nails painted a sterile, glossy, clear coat. She didn't look like a nurse. She looked like a mercenary hired off a gig app. I pushed my hand against the doorframe, leaning in. You need to leave. You have no lease here. I am the homeowner. Vita didn't budge. Mr. Hensley, I am an employee of your mother. She is a vulnerable adult. If you attempt to forcefully remove me or her, I am legally obligated to call Adult Protective Services and report you for elder endangerment. Now, if you'll excuse me, Margaret needs her blood pressure checked. She shut the door in my face. The deadbolt clicked again. I stood on the concrete patio my mother had illegally commissioned, surrounded by the rotting stems of my wife's ruined garden, and felt a cold, deep dread settle in my stomach. My mother wasn't just fighting back. She had weaponized the system. When I walked back into the kitchen, Renee was still standing exactly where I left her. Connor was leaning against the refrigerator, his arms crossed over his apron. I didn't have to say anything. My face said it all. She hired a fake nurse, I said, my voice hollow. The woman claims she has a 90-day right of occupancy because my mother is a vulnerable adult. She threatened to call Adult Protective Services on us. Renee didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She walked back to the dining room table, sat down, and opened her laptop. I'm calling Blythe, Renee said. Blythe answered on the second ring. When Renee put her on speaker and relayed what had just happened, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Blythe? Renee prompted. She's getting good advice, Blythe said finally. Her voice had lost its surgical detachment. It sounded strained. Caden Trask is a shark. He specializes in tenant rights and elder law. He knows exactly what he's doing. By introducing a medical caregiver, they just blew up your 20-day notice. You can't execute a standard at will eviction if there's a claim of medical necessity and a secondary occupant who asserts tenancy rights through employment. judgment. So what do we do? I asked, leaning over the table. You hire a litigator. Now, Blythe said. I do commercial real estate. You need someone who fights in the mud. I know a guy named Jasper Farrow. He's aggressive, and he hates Caden Trask. But he's not cheap. His retainer is $15,000, and that just gets him to open the file. $15,000. We had just written a check for Connor's first semester housing at the University of Washington. We had exactly $19,000 in our emergency savings account. Renee looked at me. It wasn't a question. Give me his number, I said to Blythe. The next morning, I wired $15,000 to Jasper Farrow's trust account. We had a Zoom consultation at noon. Jasper was a guy in his late 50s, with thinning hair, sitting in an office that looked like a bomb had gone off in a paper factory. Your mother is running a classic stall and bleed campaign, Jasper said, shuffling a stack of files. Trask is going to file every injunction he can think of. He's going to claim she has an equitable interest because of the shower tiles. He's going to claim elder abuse. He's going to try and drag this out for a year, hoping you run out of money and just let her stay to stop the financial bleeding. How do we get her out? Renee asked. We file a formal unlawful detainer, and we simultaneously file for a declaratory judgment stating she has no ownership interest in the property, Jasper explained. But here's the reality check, folks. During this time, she is going to live 40 feet from your back door. You cannot cut off her power. You cannot cut off her water. You cannot change the locks. If you do, Trask will sue you for constructive eviction and he will win. You have to treat her like a hostile tenant who has the backing of the state. The reality of that warning set in over the weekend. Saturday morning, I was drinking coffee at the kitchen island. I looked out the window. Vita was sitting on the carriage house porch, drinking out of one of our good ceramic mugs. I didn't know how she got it. At 10:00 a.m., the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a delivery guy holding 3 large grocery bags from Whole Foods. Delivery for Margaret Hensley, he said. She lives in the back unit, I said, pointing down the driveway. Instructions say to drop it at the main house kitchen. The driver replied, looking at his phone. Before I could argue, Vita appeared from the side yard. She walked right past me, into my house, and started grabbing the bags. What are you doing? I snapped, stepping into her path. Grabbing Margaret's groceries, Vita said pleasantly. Our mini fridge in the back is full. Margaret said it was fine to use the main refrigerator in your garage for the overflow, since she paid for the appliance, of course. My mother hadn't paid for the garage refrigerator. She had bought us a $100 gift card to Home Depot 6 years ago when we bought the fridge, and she had somehow mentally converted that into partial ownership. You are not using our garage, I said, my voice rising. Get out of my house. Vita smiled. It was the same chilling practice smile from the door. Mr. Hensley, preventing a caregiver from storing vital nutritional supplies for a vulnerable senior could be construed as harassment. I'm sure Mr. Trask would love to add that to his file. Renee appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She was holding a laundry basket. She looked at Vita, then at the groceries. Take the bags, Renee said to Vita. Her voice was ice. If you set foot inside this house again without an invitation, I will call the police and have you trespassed. I don't care who you work for. This is my primary residence. You have no legal right to cross the threshold. Vita's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She grabbed the bags and walked out, letting the screen door slam behind her. Renee walked over to the front door, locked the deadbolt, and flipped the security chain. She didn't look at me. She just carried the laundry basket into the utility room. The psychological warfare bled into the neighborhood by Tuesday. I was pulling the trash bins to the curb when Emerson, a retired pilot who lived next door, walked over. He had always been friendly. We shared a fence line and occasionally drank beers over it during the summer. Emerson looked uncomfortable. He shoved his hands in his pockets. Hey Arlo, everything okay over there? Just dealing with some family stuff, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Right, well listen. Emerson hesitated. Margaret caught me by the mailbox yesterday. She was in a wheelchair, looked awful pale. She said you guys were trying to throw her in a state-run nursing home so you could rent the carriage house out to tech bros on Airbnb. I felt my blood pressure spike. My mother didn't own a wheelchair. She walked 2 miles a day at the mall before this started. She's not in a wheelchair, Emerson. She's perfectly healthy. And we aren't Airbnb-ing anything. We asked her to leave because she's been emotionally abusing Renee. Emerson held up his hands, taking a step back. Hey man, it's not my business. I'm just saying, it's a bad look. Throwing your own mother on the street. She was crying, Arlo. Said she didn't know where she was going to sleep next month. My own mother was running a smear campaign over the fence line. She was playing the victim to the entire street, painting Renee and me as greedy, heartless monsters. I could see the judgment in Emerson's eyes. He didn't believe me. He believed the frail old woman crying in the rented wheelchair. I walked back into the house, my hands shaking with rage. I wanted to march back there and kick the door in. I wanted to scream at her until my lungs gave out. But Jasper's voice echoed in my head. You have to treat her like a hostile tenant. You cannot retaliate. I went into the garage to grab a wrench to fix a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink. As I walked past the deep freezer, I noticed something white taped to the side door. It was a piece of mail, addressed to me and Renee. I ripped it off and opened it. It was a formal notice of intent to file a mechanic's lien. It was from Thad, the landscaper my mother had hired to destroy the hydrangeas. The notice stated that the $3,500 bill for the concrete forms and the site prep had not been paid, since the work was performed on my property. Thad was placing a lien on my house until the debt was settled. My mother hadn't paid him in cash like the contractor had claimed. Or if she had only paid a deposit, leaving me holding the bag for the destruction of my own wife's garden. If a mechanic's lien was filed and perfected, it would tank our credit score. It could trigger a default clause in our mortgage. I stood in the cold garage, staring at the paper, realizing that my mother wasn't just trying to stay in the carriage house. She was trying to burn our entire life to the ground. I folded the heavy paper in half. The crease felt sharp against my thumb. I couldn't hide it. There was no point. I walked back into the house, through the utility room, and found Renee in the kitchen. She was wiping down the granite island with a sponge, using short, aggressive strokes. I set the folded notice on the counter. Thad is filing a mechanic's lien. She stopped wiping. She didn't look at the paper. She just looked at my hands. How much? $3,500 for the concrete forms and the labor. I swallowed hard. She never paid him. She just told him to do it and walked away. Renee dropped the sponge into the sink. It landed with a wet, heavy thud. She picked up the notice and read it, her eyes tracking the legal jargon without a flicker of emotion. Call him, she said. Renee, we shouldn't pay this. It's extortion. We didn't authorize the work. If he files that lien, Arlo, the bank gets notified. If the bank gets notified, they can call our mortgage due in full for breach of contract. We don't have $600,000 sitting in checking. Call him. Tell him we'll give him a cashier's check tomorrow morning if he signs a release of lien. lien. That's Connor's meal plan money for the fall, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I'll take on a freelance bookkeeping client on weekends, she said instantly. I'll make it up. Just get the lien off our house. I will not let that woman take our home. I called Thad the next morning. We met in the parking lot of a local diner. He looked sheepish, holding a clipboard against his chest. I handed him the envelope with the cashier's check. Look, man, Thad muttered, refusing to meet my eyes as he handed over the release form. I didn't want to get legal, but your mom, she told me a whole different story. I stopped with my hand on the car door. What did she tell you? Thad shifted his weight. She told me you and your wife were going through a nasty divorce. Said your wife was moving out and she was taking over the property management to help you keep the place. She said you were too stressed to deal with contractors, so she was handling the upgrades. I thought I was doing a favor. I stared at him. The sheer calculated malice of it took my breath away. She wasn't just acting out. She was building a narrative. She was planting seeds all over town, with the contractor, with Emerson next door, probably with anyone who would listen. I drove home in a daze. When I pulled into the driveway, there was a strange car parked in my spot. A beat-up silver Honda Civic with a cracked taillight. I parked on the street and walked up to the car. A temporary parking permit hung from the rearview mirror. It belonged to Vita. I marched back to the carriage house. I didn't knock this time. I pounded. Vita answered, looking mildly annoyed. She was wearing a lavender scrub top and holding a clipboard. Mr. Hensley, I asked you to respect our quiet hours. Move your car, I demanded. You are parked in my driveway. Margaret authorized me to park there, Vita replied smoothly. As her live-in medical staff, I require immediate access to my vehicle in case of an emergency transport. The street is too far. Mr. Trask assured us that reasonable accommodations for medical necessity supersede your driveway preferences. I felt a vein pulsing in my forehead. Move it, or I'm calling a tow truck. If you tow my car, I will call the police and file a report for malicious interference with a medical caregiver, Vita said, her voice dropping to a low warning register. Do you want squad cars in your driveway, Arlo? Do you want your neighbors watching the police question you about harassing a nurse? Emerson already seems quite concerned. She knew about Emerson. My mother was feeding her information. They were working together. I backed away. I had to. Jasper had been crystal clear. Do not escalate. Do not give them an excuse to call the cops. Do not hand Trask any ammunition. I walked back to the main house, my chest tight with a suffocating, impotent rage. Inside, Connor was sitting at the dining room table, his laptop open. He looked up when I walked in. He looked exhausted. He was 18, but the last 2 weeks had aged him. The excitement of his graduation had completely evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of the war zone his home had become. Dad, he said quietly, look at this. I walked over and looked at the screen. It was our joint family banking portal. Connor had a savings account linked to ours, the one we had been putting his birthday and Christmas money into since he was a kid. It was supposed to cover his textbooks and incidentals for his freshman year. The balance was zero. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen. What happened? Where did the money go? I don't know, Connor said, his voice shaking slightly. I logged in to pay my phone bill. It says there was a transfer yesterday afternoon, $4,200, to an external account. Did you authorize it? I asked, panic rising in my throat. No, why would I? I pulled out my phone and dialed the bank's fraud department. The hold music played for 20 agonizing minutes before a representative picked up. I explained the situation, my voice tight. Let me check that transaction, Mr. Hensley, the representative said. Keys clacked in the background. That transfer wasn't flagged as fraud because it was initiated by a joint account holder, Margaret Hensley. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. What? Margaret isn't on that account. Actually, sir, she is, the representative corrected gently. She was added as a custodial signer when the account was opened 12 years ago, since she made the initial deposit of $50. She never removed herself. She executed the transfer in branch yesterday. She took his money. She stole her own grandson's college savings. I hung up the phone and looked at Connor. He was staring at his hands. She took it, I said, the words barely more than a whisper. Before Connor could react, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was an email from Jasper Farrow. The subject line read, urgent, Trask injunction filed. I opened the email. Jasper's message was brief. Arlo, Trask just filed the injunction to halt the eviction, but he added a new motion. Margaret is claiming that the $5,000 cashier's check she gave Connor was actually an advance on a negotiated rent agreement that you subsequently tried to refuse. She submitted a forged ledger. Check your bank accounts immediately. Trask is claiming she deposited $4,200 into Connor's account yesterday as back rent to prove she is a paying tenant in good standing. Call me. She didn't steal the money. She did something much, much worse. She used Connor's account to launder a fake rent payment. She hijacked his savings account to create a paper trail proving she was a legitimate paying tenant. And because the account was linked to our family portal, legally, she had just paid us rent. Renee walked into the room holding a stack of clean towels. She looked at my face, then at Connor's. What? She asked, her voice instantly dropping into that cold, defensive register. What did she do now? I held out the phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the screen steady. She just bought herself another 6 months, I said, and she used Connor to do it. Renee didn't scream. She didn't throw the towels. She set the stack down on the kitchen island with terrifying precision, aligning the edges perfectly with the grout line of the granite. She looked at Connor. Get your laptop, she told him. Her voice was stripped of all warmth, completely clinical. Move every remaining cent in that account to a new one at a completely different bank. Do it right now. I don't care if it's a digital bank. Just get it out of that institution. Then call them and close the joint account permanently. Connor nodded quickly, his fingers flying across his keyboard. It's processing. The rest is going to a Chime account I opened for work. Renee turned to me. Call Jasper. Tell him we want an emergency hearing to freeze that money. I dialed Jasper's number. He answered on the third ring. I put him on speakerphone and explained the transfer. For a long moment, the only sound on the line was the scratch of a pen against paper. It's a textbook checkmate move, Jasper said finally, sounding genuinely impressed, which only made me sicker. Trask found a loophole. Because your mother was an original signatory, she didn't steal the money. Legally, she withdrew her own funds. And by depositing them directly into your primary joint account with a memo line reading rent arrears, she has established a documented history of tenancy. If we go to a judge and say she stole it, Trask will produce the bank charter showing she had full access. So we just let her take $4,000 from an 18-year-old? I asked, my voice cracking. For now, yes, Jasper said. If we file an injunction to reverse the transfer, Trask will argue you're trying to financially starve a tenant to force an illegal eviction. He'll bury us in discovery. My advice? You eat the loss for now. now. We focus on the unlawful detainer. But Arlo, listen to me carefully. Because she is now officially a paying tenant on paper, she has tenant rights. Do not interact with her. Do not step foot in that carriage house. I hung up the phone. The house was dead silent. I looked at Renee. She was staring out the window toward the carriage house. I'm going to take the extra bookkeeping client, she said quietly. I'll start tonight. Connor, you can use my car to get to work. We'll figure out your meal plan. Mom, I can pick up more shifts, Connor said, his voice thick. You don't have to do that. Renee walked over and put her hand on the back of his neck. It was the first time I'd seen her touch him with that kind of maternal tenderness since this whole nightmare started. You focus on getting ready for school. Your father and I will handle Margaret. She didn't call her mom. She didn't even call her your grandmother. She was just Margaret now, an adversary. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Now that Margaret had established herself as a paying tenant, she began to exercise her rights. On Thursday morning, I received an email. It wasn't from Trask. It was from a generic Gmail account named margarethensleytenancy@gmail.com. The subject line read, "Formal maintenance request, urgent medical necessity." I opened it on my phone while standing in the driveway. The email was written in Vita's sterile professional tone. It stated that the mini split-ack unit in the carriage house was failing to maintain a consistent temperature of 68 degrees, which was allegedly required for Margaret's circulatory condition. Attached was a scanned, blurry note from a telemedicine doctor I had never heard of, recommending a temperature-controlled environment. The email concluded, "As the landlord, you have 24 hours to service the HVAC unit. If a licensed technician is not dispatched by 9 a.m. tomorrow, the tenant will exercise their right to repair and deduct under Washington state law, hiring an emergency contractor and deducting the cost from future rent." I walked into the house and showed the email to Renee. She was sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by receipts from her new freelance client. She barely glanced at it. "She wants us to hire someone to fix an ACK unit that is barely 2 years old," I said, rubbing my temples. "And if we don't, she's going to hire someone herself and charge us for it. Call the company that installed it," Renee said without looking up from her spreadsheet. "It's still under warranty. Have them send a tech out. Make sure you get a signed invoice stating the unit is functioning perfectly. Build the paper trail." I did exactly that. The fact tech arrived at 2 o'clock. I met him in the driveway and explained he needed to check the unit on the carriage house. I watched from the patio as Vita opened the door, her face a mask of polite concern. She let the tech inside. 20 minutes later, the tech walked back out. He looked annoyed. "Unit's fine," he said, handing me a clipboard. It was set to 75 degrees on the remote. I turned it down to 68. It blew cold immediately. "Nothing's broken. Can you write that on the invoice?" I asked. "That the unit was fully functional and just set to the wrong temperature?" He shrugged. "Sure, man, but there's a $150 dispatch fee since it wasn't a warranty issue. The lady in the back said you were covering it." I paid the $150 out of our checking account. I scanned the invoice and emailed it back to the tenancy Gmail address. I felt like a rat in a maze, running exactly where Margaret and Trask wanted me to run. By Friday evening, the neighborhood dynamic had shifted from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Renee and I were eating dinner in silence when I heard the sound of a vehicle backing up our driveway. It wasn't Vita's beat-up Civic. It was a large, black, accessible transit van. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window. The van's rear doors opened, and an automated lift lowered to the pavement. Emerson, our neighbor, was standing at the end of the driveway, watching with his arms crossed. The driver wheeled my mother out of the van. She was sitting in a high-backed medical wheelchair. She looked frail. She had a thick wool blanket draped over her lap, despite it being a humid 70 degrees outside. Vita was walking beside her, holding a canvas tote bag. Emerson walked over to the van. I cracked the kitchen window open, straining to hear. "Margaret, let me help you," Emerson said, his voice thick with concern. He grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. "Thank you, Emerson," my mother said, her voice a weak, trembling whisper that I had never heard her use in my entire life. "The treatments just take it out of me. I'm so glad Vita is here." "Treatments? What treatments?" "She took a daily pill for cholesterol and drank white wine." Emerson glared at my house. He looked right at the cracked window. "If you need anything, Margaret, you call me. I don't care what time it is. You shouldn't have to go through this alone. My son is he's under a lot of pressure," my mother whimpered. "His wife handles the finances. I just try to stay out of her way." I slammed the window shut. My hands were shaking. I turned around. Renee was standing right behind me. She had heard everything. She walked past me, unbolted the back door, and stepped out onto the patio. "Renee, don't," I hissed, reaching for her arm. She ignored me. She walked straight across the grass, stopping 10 feet from the carriage house porch where Emerson was helping wheel my mother up the small ramp. Emerson stopped. He looked at Renee, his face hardening. My mother let out a small, sharp gasp, shrinking back into the wheelchair. Vita stepped in front of her, a human shield in lavender scrubs. "Renee," Emerson said, his tone a warning. "Leave her alone." Renee didn't look at Emerson. She didn't look at Vita. She locked eyes with my mother. "You stole $4,200 from your grandson's college fund," Renee said. Her voice wasn't loud. It carried perfectly in the quiet evening air. "You walked into a bank, used a defunct custodial signature, and drained an 18-year-old savings. You can put on whatever theater production you want for the neighborhood, Margaret, but you and I both know exactly what you are." Emerson looked confused. He glanced down at my mother. "Margaret, what is she talking about?" My mother's face twitched. The frail, trembling persona vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by that cold, aristocratic fury. But she recovered quickly. She let out a dry, hacking cough and pressed a hand to her chest. "Vita," my mother gasped, closing her eyes. "My heart, please get me inside." Vita immediately took the handles from Emerson. "Mr. Emerson, thank you. We need to get her oxygen." She quickly wheeled my mother into the carriage house and slammed the door. The deadbolt clicked. Emerson stood on the driveway looking awkwardly at Renee. "She stole his tuition money to pay a lawyer to sue us," Renee said to Emerson, her voice completely flat. "If you want to push her wheelchair, Emerson, that's your business. But don't you ever stand in my driveway and judge me again." Renee turned around and walked back into the house. I stayed outside for a moment, watching Emerson. He looked at the closed carriage house door, then at me. He didn't say anything. He just shoved his hands into his pockets and walked back to his own property. It was a small victory, a tiny puncture in her narrative, but it cost us whatever peace we had left. The retaliation came on Monday morning. I left for work at 7:30. I work at a mid-sized engineering firm in Bellevue. I've been there for 8 years. I manage a team of 6 junior engineers. It's a stable, quiet job. At 10:15, my desk phone rang. It was the receptionist from the front desk. "Arlo," she said, her voice sounding tight. "There's a courier here for you." you. He says he needs a direct signature. It's legal. My stomach plummeted. I walked out to the lobby. A guy in a windbreaker handed me a thick manila envelope and a clipboard. I signed for it, took it back to my cubicle, and ripped it open. It wasn't from Caden Trask. It was from the City of Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections. It was a formal notice of violation. I read through the paperwork, the blood draining from my face. An anonymous complaint had been filed regarding the carriage house. The complaint alleged that the plumbing and electrical work completed during the renovation 2 years ago was performed without proper municipal permits. Attached to the city notice was a secondary letter from Trask. Dear Mr. Hensley, as you are aware, my client Margaret Hensley is a legal tenant residing in the ado located on your property. Due to recent concerns regarding the safety and habitability of the unit, specifically regarding unpermitted electrical wiring that poses a severe fire hazard to a vulnerable adult, we were legally obligated to notify the city inspector. Until the unit is brought up to code and fully permitted, my client will be placing her monthly rent into an escrow account. I dropped the papers on my desk. When we renovated the carriage house, we spent $85,000. But to save money, I had done the interior wiring and the bathroom plumbing myself. I am an engineer. I know how to run Romex wire and solder copper pipe. It was perfectly safe, but I never pulled the permits. My mother knew that. She had praised me for it at the time, bragging to her friends about how handy her son was. Now, she had turned me in to the city. The city notice stated that I had 30 days to open the walls, expose the plumbing and electrical, hire a licensed inspector, and pay retroactive permitting fees and fines. If I failed to comply, the city would issue a stop work order and impose a fine of $500 per day. To comply, I would have to rip out the drywall I had hung. I would have to destroy the custom shower my mother claimed she owned. I would have to spend thousands of dollars I didn't have. And the worst part was, I couldn't even access the building to do the work. Trask had made sure of that, because to open the walls, I would need to enter the carriage house. And to enter the carriage house, I would need to give Margaret a 48-hour notice of entry for maintenance, which Vita would immediately block by claiming it endangered Margaret's health. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. I sat at my desk for an hour, staring at the city seal on the notice of violation until the black ink blurred. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a dentist's drill. I didn't even pack up my briefcase. I just grabbed my keys, walked out of the office, and drove straight to Jasper Farrow's building. I didn't have an appointment. I sat in his waiting room for 45 minutes until his paralegal finally ushered me into his chaotic office. Jasper was eating a turkey sandwich over an open legal pad. I threw the city notice and Trask's letter onto his desk. Jasper wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, picked up the notice, and read it. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a doctor looking at an x-ray of a terminal disease he had diagnosed 100 times before. The unpermitted work, Jasper said, tapping the paper. You did it yourself? Yes, I'm a mechanical engineer. The wiring is flawless. The plumbing is to code. I just didn't pull the municipal permits because it saves $3,000 and takes 6 months of waiting for inspectors. Well, now it's going to cost you 10, Jasper said bluntly. Trask played a beautiful card here. He weaponized the Department of Construction and Inspections against you. Here is your catch-22, Arlo. To fix the violation, you have to open the walls. To open the walls, you have to enter the unit. To enter the unit, you have to give 48 hours notice. When you give that notice, Vita will produce a doctor's note stating the noise, dust, and disruption of construction will cause your mother severe medical distress. If you force your way in, Vita calls the police for elder endangerment and illegal lockout. So I just let the city fine me $500 a day? I asked, my voice rising. In 30 days, that's $15,000. In 60 days, they put a tax lien on my house. You don't let them fine you, Jasper said. You file for an emergency stay with the city based on tenant obstruction. But the city bureaucracy moves at a glacial pace. Trask knows this. He is trying to create a financial pressure cooker so intense that you come to the table and offer Margaret a cash for keys buyout. He wants you to pay her $50,000 to leave. I felt the blood drain from my face. $50,000? We don't have $50,000. Then you buckle in, Jasper said, leaning back in his chair. You post the 48-hour notice today. You show up on Thursday with your tools. When Vita blocks you, you don't argue. You take a photo of her blocking the door, you document the refusal of entry, and you send it to me. We build the paper trail. We prove to the city that you are attempting to comply, but the tenant is obstructing. I drove home. The Seattle traffic was a crawl of red taillights, perfectly matching the suffocating gridlock in my own life. When I walked into the kitchen, Renee was at the island. She wasn't cooking. She hadn't cooked a real meal in 2 weeks. She was eating cold toast and staring at a spreadsheet on her laptop. She had taken on 3 new bookkeeping clients. Her eyes had dark, bruised-looking circles under them. I set the city notice on the granite next to her laptop. I explained what Jasper had said. I explained the catch-22. I explained the $500 a day fine. Renee didn't cry. She just stared at the glowing screen of her laptop. She reached out and closed the lid. The kitchen plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. We are going to lose the house, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a mathematical calculation. We aren't going to lose the house, I said, though my voice lacked any real conviction. Jasper is filing a stay. I'm going to post the notice of entry right now. On Thursday, I'm going to go in there and open the walls. She won't let you. I'll call the police, I said. I'll show them the city mandate. Renee looked at me. The exhaustion in her eyes was so deep it terrified me. Arlo, the police don't care about drywall. They care about optics. And the optics are a 70-year-old woman and her nurse being terrorized by a landlord. I didn't answer. I went to my office, typed up a formal 48-hour notice of intent to enter for maintenance, printed it, and walked out to the carriage house. I taped it to the frosted glass. Vita was watching me through the window, sipping a glass of water. I took a picture of the notice on the door with my phone, capturing Vita's smug face in the background, and walked away. The next 48 hours were a slow-motion nightmare. Connor was leaving for college on Sunday. The entire milestone was eclipsed by the war in our backyard. He spent his time quietly packing his room, avoiding the windows that faced the carriage house. We didn't have a celebratory dinner. We ordered terrible takeout and ate it in silence. Thursday morning arrived. I took the day off work. At exactly 9 a.m., I walked out to the carriage house carrying a tool bucket, a drywall saw, and a heavy crowbar. I felt ridiculous, like I was pantomiming construction work. I knocked on the door. Vita opened it. She wasn't wearing scrubs today. She was wearing a thick cable-knit sweater and a medical mask. She held a clipboard against her chest. Good morning, Arlo, she said, her voice muffled by the mask. It's been 48 hours, I said, holding up my tool bucket. I am entering swearing to expose the plumbing and electrical to comply with the city mandate. Vita didn't move. She handed me a piece of paper from her clipboard. "This is a directive from Margaret's primary care physician," Vita said, reciting the words as if she had rehearsed them in a mirror. "Due to acute respiratory distress and elevated blood pressure, Margaret cannot be subjected to airborne particulates, noise pollution, or structural vibrations for the next 14 days. Entering this unit with demolition tools constitutes a direct threat to her life." I didn't take the paper. I dropped my tool bucket onto the concrete patio. The heavy metal tools clanged against the plastic. "Move aside, Vita," I said. "I am coming in." Vita took a half step back, pulling her phone from her pocket. "If you cross this threshold, I am dialing 911. I will tell them an aggressive male is attempting to forcefully enter the medical sanctuary of an elderly woman. The police response time in this zip code is under 4 minutes." I stood there, gripping the handle of the crowbar. I wanted to smash the frosted glass. I wanted to tear the custom shower out with my bare hands. But Jasper's voice rang in my ears. "Do not escalate. Do not give them an excuse." I pulled my phone out instead. I dialed the non-emergency police line. I explained that I had a tenant dispute regarding city-mandated repairs and requested an officer to mediate entry. Vita didn't look panicked. She just crossed her arms and waited. 20 minutes later, a Seattle PD cruiser pulled into our driveway. 2 officers got out. One was young, maybe 25, with a tight buzz cut. The other was older, looking completely bored before he even reached the backyard. I walked over to them, holding the city notice of violation and my printed 48-hour notice. "Officers," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I am the homeowner. I have a city mandate to expose unpermitted work inside this ado. I posted the required 48-hour notice. The tenant is refusing entry." The older officer took the paperwork, glanced at it, and sighed. He walked over to Vita, who was standing in the doorway looking deeply concerned. "Ma'am, is this your residence?" the officer asked. "I am the registered live-in caregiver for Margaret Hensley," Vita said softly, her tone entirely different from the cold mercenary she was with me. "Margaret is 70 years old. She is currently on bed rest with severe respiratory issues. Mr. Hensley wants to tear down the drywall today. The dust could trigger a fatal asthma attack. I have the doctor's directive right here." She handed the officer the paper. The officer looked at it, then looked back at me. He handed my city notice back to me. "Sir, this is a civil matter," the older officer said. "It's a city mandate," I argued. "If I don't do the work, I get fined $500 a day." "I get that, but I'm not a building inspector," the officer replied, his tone hardening. "And I'm not dragging a sick woman out of her bed so you can swing a hammer. If the tenant has a medical injunction, you have to take it up with housing court. We don't enforce evictions or maintenance entries without a signed judge's order." "She's lying," I said, pointing at Vita. "There is nothing wrong with my mother. She's faking it to stall the eviction." The younger officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. "Sir, you need to lower your voice and step back from the door. We aren't going to have a breach of the peace here today. Take your tools and go back to the main house. Call your lawyer." I looked at the officers. I looked at Vita, whose eyes above the medical mask were flat and triumphant. I was standing on my own land holding a legally mandated order from the city, and the police were treating me like a trespasser. I picked up my tool bucket. I turned my back on them and walked to the house. I could feel Vita watching me all the way. The weekend arrived like a funeral dirge. Sunday morning was overcast and gray, the kind of oppressive Seattle weather that matches a ruined mood perfectly. Connor's Honda Civic was parked in the driveway, the trunk open. We spent the morning loading his boxes, his mini fridge, and his clothes. Nobody spoke. The excitement of a kid moving into his first dorm room was entirely dead. Connor looked pale and exhausted. He had lost his college savings, his sanctuary, and his respect for his grandmother all in a span of a month. Renee handed him a Tupperware container of cookies she had baked at midnight. She hugged him tight, burying her face in his shoulder. I saw her shoulders shake, just once, before she pulled back and forced a tight, brittle smile. "Call me when you get your keys," Renee said, her voice thick. "We'll come down next weekend and take you to dinner. Whatever you want." "Okay, Mom," Connor said quietly. I hugged him next. "I'm sorry, Connor. I'm sorry this is how you're leaving." "It's not your fault, Dad," he said. He looked over my shoulder toward the backyard. His expression hardened into pure glacial contempt. I turned around. My mother was standing on the porch of the carriage house. She wasn't in a wheelchair. She wasn't holding an oxygen tank. She was wearing a tailored beige cardigan and holding a mug of coffee. She was watching us load the car. She caught Connor's eye and offered a small, sad wave. The tragic grandmother bidding farewell from afar. Connor didn't wave back. He didn't even blink. He just turned around, got into his car, shut the door, and backed out of the driveway. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. I watched his car disappear down the street, taking the last piece of light in our house with him. Renee turned and walked inside without looking at my mother. I stood in the driveway for a long time, staring at the woman on the porch. She took a sip of her coffee, gave me a tight, unreadable smile, and went back inside. The breaking point didn't come from a dramatic confrontation. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, in the most mundane way possible. The regular mail carrier, a guy named Dave who always waved, was on vacation. We had a substitute carrier that week, a young woman who seemed perpetually rushed. I got home from work at 5:30. The air inside the house was stifling. Renee was at the dining room table, surrounded by a fortress of receipts and bank statements from her bookkeeping clients. She looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. I walked out to the mailbox by the curb. It was stuffed full. The substitute carrier had shoved a thick stack of envelopes inside, crumpling the edges of a magazine. I brought the stack inside and dropped it on the kitchen counter. I started sorting it. Junk mail, a water bill, a flyer for a local roofing company, and then a heavy, oversized white envelope. It had a cellophane window. The return address in the corner was a logo I instantly recognized: Stanton and Hayes Wealth Management, La Jolla, California. I looked at the name in the window. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to Renee. It was addressed to Margaret Hensley. It had been delivered to the main house by mistake. Vita usually intercepted the mail, but she must have missed the substitute carrier. I stared at the envelope. My mother lived on a fixed state pension of $1,200 a month. That was the entire narrative of her life. That was why she needed the carriage house. That was why I had paid her car insurance for the last 5 years. That was why Renee had worked 60-hour weeks, to ensure my destitute mother didn't end up in a substandard state facility. Wealth management firms in La Jolla don't send quarterly statements to people living on $1,200 a month. My heart started to beat in a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the envelope. The flap was sealed with a thick adhesive, but the corner was slightly loose where the mail carrier had jammed it into the box. It was a federal crime to open someone someone else's mail. It was a felony. I slid my thumb under the loose corner of the flap and ripped it open. I pulled out the thick stack of premium, watermarked paper. It was a comprehensive quarterly portfolio summary. I scanned past the legal disclaimers and the market performance graphs, my eyes searching for the summary table. I found it on page 3. Total portfolio value, $842,516.40. I stopped breathing. The kitchen dissolved around me. I blinked hard, thinking my exhausted brain had misplaced a decimal point. I read it again. $842,000. The portfolio was a mix of municipal bonds, high-yield dividend stocks, and a liquid cash sweep account containing over $90,000. I looked at the transaction history. Every month, a distribution of $4,500 was wired to an external account at a regional bank in Idaho. She had a hidden bank account. She was pulling in $4,500 a month in passive income, tax-free from the municipal bonds, while claiming she couldn't afford her own groceries. She had watched Renee break her back doing overtime. She had let me take out a second mortgage to pay for the $85,000 carriage house renovation. She had stolen $4,000 from her own grandson's college fund, and she had nearly $1 million sitting in an account in California. Arlo? I jumped. Renee was standing in the doorway of the dining room, holding a red pen. She was looking at me, her brow furrowed. Are you okay? You look like you're going to pass out. I couldn't speak. I just held out the papers. Renee walked over slowly. She took the watermarked pages from my hand. She looked at the Stanton and Hayes logo. Then she looked at the portfolio value. I watched her face. I watched the realization hit her. Not like a sudden shock, but like a slow-acting poison finally reaching her heart. The 16 years of grinding, exhausting labor. The vacations we never took. The panic attacks she suffered when Connor was a toddler and we couldn't make the utility bills. All of it subsidized the lifestyle of a woman who was sitting on a fortune, simply because she felt entitled to keep her own money while spending ours. Renee didn't scream. She didn't drop the papers. She placed them on the granite counter and smoothed them out perfectly flat. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were completely, terrifyingly hollow. She didn't just insult me, Renee whispered, the words scraping out of her throat. She didn't just steal from Connor. She enslaved us. I watched her pick up the Stanton and Hayes statement. She didn't cry. She didn't throw it. She walked straight into her home office, turned on her scanner, and fed the 3 watermarked pages through the machine. The soft whirring sound filled the dead silence of the house. What are we doing? I asked, standing in the doorway. We are ending this, Renee said. She opened a new email draft to Jasper Farrow. She receives a low-income state pension, Arlo. Do you know what the asset limit is to qualify for that specific tier of state assistance? It's $2,000. She has $842,000. That means she has been committing defrauding the state of Washington for years. Renee attached the PDF to the email. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly steady. Furthermore, Renee continued, her voice slipping into the ruthless, analytical register of an executive assistant who had just found the fatal error in a corporate merger. She filed an injunction in civil court claiming to be a destitute senior citizen facing financial elder abuse. She claimed the eviction would leave her homeless. She submitted those claims under penalty of perjury, and she used Connor's bank account to launder a fake rent payment because she claimed she couldn't afford a standard deposit. It's all a lie. She hit send. We didn't sleep that night. We sat at the kitchen island, drinking black coffee, waiting for the sun to come up. At exactly 8:15 a.m., my phone rang. It was Jasper. Tell me this is real, Jasper said. No greeting, no preamble. It was delivered to our mailbox by accident, I said. It's real. I heard Jasper let out a sound that was half laugh, half sigh of absolute relief. Arlo, this isn't just a smoking gun. This is a tactical nuke. Caden Trask has built his entire defense and his entire countersuit on the legal premise that your mother is a vulnerable, impoverished adult facing financial ruin at the hands of her greedy son. If he proceeds with that defense knowing she is a millionaire, he is suborning perjury and risking his license. So what do we do? I already did it, Jasper said, the savage joy clear in his voice. I forwarded the statement to Trask 10 minutes ago with a very brief note. I told him we are filing a motion for sanctions against his firm for filing frivolous and fraudulent claims, and that we are formally notifying the state pension board, the EARS, and Adult Protective Services that his vulnerable client is hiding nearly $1 million in undeclared assets. What did he say? He didn't reply to the email. He called me. He was screaming, not at me, at the situation. Trask is a shark, but he's not an idiot. He didn't know about the money. She lied to him. He is officially withdrawing as her counsel of record as of 9 o'clock this morning. A heavy, staggering weight lifted off my chest. He's dropping her? He's running for the hills, Jasper corrected. Without Trask, the medical injunction falls apart. The elder abuse claim falls apart. Vita's 90-day secondary tenancy claim falls apart because your mother can no longer legally claim destitute vulnerability to shield a caregiver. But we aren't even going to take this to housing court, Arlo. I'm drafting a settlement agreement right now. What kind of settlement? Renee asked, leaning in close to the phone speaker. A cash for keys exit on our terms, Jasper said. She vacates the property in 48 hours. She signs a quitclaim deed entirely surrendering any alleged equitable interest in the carriage house, including the shower and the fridge. She reimburses Connor the $4,200 she stole, plus the initial $5,000 from the cashier's check, as a relocation penalty. She pays my $15,000 retainer in full, and she pays the city fines for the unpermitted work. And if she says no? I asked. If she says no, we submit the Stanton and Hayes statement to the state fraud investigator, Jasper said coldly. She will face felony charges for pension fraud. She will go to federal prison. I will have a courier deliver the agreement to her door by noon. I hung up the phone. I looked at Renee. For the first time in a month, the color had returned to her face. At 12:30 p.m., a courier on a bicycle pulled up to the curb. He walked back to the carriage house, taped a thick manila envelope to the frosted glass, took a photo of it, and rode away. 10 minutes later, the carriage house door opened. Vita stepped out, looking cautious. She peeled the envelope off the glass and took it inside. I stood by the kitchen window, watching. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Suddenly, the door flew open. My mother stepped out onto the concrete patio. She wasn't wearing a silk robe or a medical mask. She was wearing a tailored blouse and slacks. Her face was flushed dark red with absolute, unbridled fury. She looked up at the main house, her eyes locking onto the kitchen window. She marched across the lawn, ignoring the ruined hydrangea beds, and pounded her fist against my back door. I didn't open it. I unlocked it, but I left the screen door shut between us. You opened my mail, she screamed. screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. That is a federal offense, Arlo. I will have you arrested. Call the police, Mom, I said smoothly, mirroring the exact tone Vita had used on me for weeks. Call them right now. I'll show them the envelope that was jammed into my mailbox by mistake, and then I'll show them the bank statements proving you've been committing state fraud for a decade. She gripped the handle of the screen door, shaking it, but the latch held. That money is mine. My husband left it to me. It's none of your business. It became my business when you let my wife work 60 hours a week to pay for the roof over your head, I said, the anger finally crystallizing into something cold and permanent. It became my business when you stole my son's college savings to launder a fake rent check. You have almost $1 million. You could have bought a condo in Bellevue. You could have hired real contractors to fix the yard, but you didn't. You wanted to live here for free so you could look down on us while spending our money. I am your mother, she shrieked, slamming her palm against the mesh screen. You owe me respect. You have 48 hours to sign Jasper's agreement and get off my property, I said, or I hit send on the email to the state fraud unit. I don't care where you go, but you are never stepping foot in my home again. I shut the heavy wooden door in her face and threw the deadbolt. Through the glass, I watched her stand there for a long time. The aristocratic mask was gone. The frail victim persona was gone. She just looked old, bitter, and entirely out of options. She turned around and walked back to the carriage house. The next morning, a moving truck pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a professional crew. It was just a rented U-Haul. Vita was driving. Vita, it turned out, was very eager to sever ties with an employer who was suddenly facing felony fraud charges and no longer had the protection of a high-powered attorney. Vita wasn't a mercenary anymore. She was just a gig worker trying to avoid getting dragged into a criminal investigation. I stood on the back patio with Renee, watching them load the boxes. My mother didn't direct the packing. She sat in the passenger seat of the U-Haul, staring straight ahead through the windshield. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the house. At 2 p.m., a digital notification pinged on Renee's phone. It was an email from Jasper. Attached was a scanned copy of the settlement agreement, signed by Margaret Hensley. Included was a wire transfer confirmation. She had paid the $15,000 legal fees, the city fines, and wired $9,200 directly into Connor's new Chime account. She had folded completely. Vita slammed the rolling door of the U-Haul shut and locked it with a padlock. She walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and started the engine. The truck backed slowly out of my driveway, crushing the last few dead stems of the hydrangeas under its heavy tires. It pulled onto the street, shifted into drive, and drove away. The silence that fell over the backyard was deafening. Renee and I walked across the grass. We stepped onto the unpermitted concrete patio. I unlocked the carriage house door and pushed it open. The space was completely empty. The custom shower door was still there. The imported tiles still gleamed in the afternoon light. It smelled faintly of lemon tea and stale perfume, but it was just a building now. The ghost had been exorcised. I walked over to the thermostat and turned the mini split-ack off. We need to call the city inspector on Monday, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty room. We'll pull the drywall down ourselves, pay the permitting fees, get it up to code. And then? Renee asked. She was standing in the doorway, the afternoon sun catching the exhausted lines around her eyes, but her posture was straight. The crushing weight was gone. And then we rented out to a nice tech bro, I said, for $2,000 a month, and we used the money to pay for a 2-week vacation to Hawaii. Just you and me. Renee looked at the empty room, then at me. A slow, genuine smile finally broke across her face. It was the first time I had seen her smile in a month. Deal, she said. We locked the carriage house, walked back across our lawn, and went into our home.